Johnny Venerable, PHNX Cardinals here with Kalyn Kahler, senior NFL writer and reporter for The Athletic. Kalyn, you dropped a banger of an article on Thursday entitled "The Troubling Arizona Cardinal Workplace Culture That Had Some Employees, quote, working in fear," and just kind of full transparency covering this team like we do here at PHNX Cardinals. Like, we've heard rumblings about this. It came back from the NFLPA survey. Things were not good with the Cardinals, how they maybe treated some of their employees. What made you want to write this article? Was it people reaching out to you? How did this all start?
Yeah, I think it started, the NFLPA survey was probably the first window into it, but this story in particular focused just on like the workplace and not the football team. I think the football team of last year in the Cliff Kingsbury era is still a really good story that needs to be told. And I had to kind of separate the material that I had because to put them into one story was just like way too much because there were so much weird things that happened last season to the coaching staff and the players. And so I didn't even touch on that in this story because it just was too much information. So the way I got into this story, which was about the workplace, so like, you know, your finance, business side, ticket sales, marketing, those people who we don't think about who work for NFL teams. I got into that because in April, Terry McDonough filed his arbitration demand to the NFL, and he was the former Cardinals executive who was alleging the burner phone scheme. And in his arbitration demand, you know, he has all these details about the burner phone scheme, which I'm sure the listeners of this podcast are very familiar with already. In that arbitration demand, he says it was a hostile workplace environment. I think hostile was the word that he used. And he accuses Michael Bidwill of bullying him, harassing him, and retaliation. And then he has some other details in there about things he either saw or heard of happening, like Bidwill yelling at a young African-American scout who parked in his parking spot was one of the examples. And then Bidwill also yelling at 2 pregnant women. Those were also part of Terry's complaint. So those really were interesting to me because I was like, wow, this sounds like a terrible place to work. Like, let's see what I can find out. Because some of the stuff in Terry's complaint was like secondhand. He was like he didn't witness it. He's like, you know, it was phrased like he'd heard of this instance. So I wanted to start reaching out to as many people I could find who either worked for the Cardinals or currently worked for the Cardinals. So that's what I did since April. Took a break over the summer. I wasn't like doing this for the last, 6 months continuously, but I started calling people shortly after Terry's complaint just to try to find out more. And I'd already been kind of digging a little bit into like the football side of things. So then I was like, well, there actually might be something more interesting on the workplace side of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic read. I encourage everybody, go check it out. There's a ton to break down, but it's something that I thought in particular was incredibly damning. How does a professional NFL franchise not have a human resources department?
Yeah.
Like not have a rep, a human resources relations department for upwards of 10 plus years? Like how does that happen in a multi-billion-dollar corporation business like the NFL? Like, is this common with other teams?
I don't know. I didn't do a all 32 search to see who has an HR director in their media guides. I mean, I looked, throughout the division and like sporadically, and it seems like most teams do. But I didn't go, I didn't do a thorough search and like looking back. I mean, the Cardinals do now. They've had one since 2021. So, I didn't go back, to 2010 to see which NFL teams had an HR director and which ones didn't. I would say it's definitely very out of the ordinary for a business that's bringing in the amount of revenue that the Cardinals are and that employs the amount of people that the Cardinals do. They have about 250 employees, which including the football staff, coaching staff, player personnel, everything on the football side is all of that together with the other employees is about 250. So that's a pretty big company. And for context, the last media company I worked for had about 22 staffers, and we were a startup and we hired an outside, independent HR firm. Like we just consulted with them. We didn't employ a full-time HR person, but we contracted another company. And when I was checking this with the Cardinals and asking them, hey, am I correct that everyone told me you didn't have an HR department, you didn't have an HR director? And if you go through and look at their media guides, there's no one in the role. They have one person in finance who had a slash. Her title was like payroll / benefits, or like HR coordinator was in her role. But when I talked to people who worked there, they were all like, no, she didn't do HR. She did like literally payroll issues. She didn't do, if you have an issue in the workplace, like who do you resolve it with? She didn't do anything like that. So that was really odd to me. And that was something that like everyone I spoke to kept bringing up, because they were like, yeah, we had all these problems, but we had nowhere to go with the problems, because, if we had a problem with our manager, like the way that they were supposed to handle it at the time without an HR department was to go to the manager. So they were supposed to take their complaints to the person essentially that they had a problem with, which obviously is an issue. So that was really surprising to me that they really didn't have and the team told me, well, we didn't ignore the survey in 2019. We didn't ignore the employee survey, because what came out of that was that we hired our first chief people officer because people said they wanted an HR department. So yeah, I mean, the team is like fully admitting that they did not have an HR department.
That's incredible.
And they didn't know they needed one until people told them in a survey that so that part was really strange, very strange.
Well, and I think one of the most damning pieces of the entire article, and then some sub bullets that came back from the suit from this past spring, is the mistreatment of women and the perpetual fear that they have lived in going into the workplace consistently, and just the archaic. Like I read some of your excerpts in the article, and it's like 1950s, like kind of how we treat, women in the workplace, housewife-esque. That's what it reminded me of, which is really, really disheartening as somebody who loves the Cardinals, covers this team, that women in the workplace, maybe people of color, were being treated this way for an NFL franchise in the modern era. Like, there are a lot of people in this fan base that would love to see this franchise under new ownership. Like, do you believe with this information coming into light, like, is Roger Goodell going to be prompted to do an internal investigation? Because people have alluded to that. This is a franchise. They host Super Bowls. They put on a good show when necessary. But I mean, like this mistreatment of women and making women not feel comfortable to go about and have conversations with professional athletes, that's absurd.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this all adds up to enough for the NFL to investigate. I thought that the burner phone scheme would probably be enough for them to investigate, but they didn't based off of that. So I'm not sure that all of my reporting and these details are really interesting and are definitely a problematic workplace environment, but I don't know if any of it on its own rises to the level of warranting an investigation. It's an interesting idea to explore. And I know Pro Football Talk, when they wrote it up today, they had asked the same question. They said, maybe people at Park Avenue will read this and it'll be enough for them to conduct an investigation. So I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sure there's league meetings next week with owners and team presidents. So I'm sure somebody will probably ask Roger Goodell that question, and I'm sure he won't actually answer it. But I don't know exactly, what it will all add up to, but I was shocked. And that was another reason that I wanted to start reporting this, because I had heard that women who worked for the team in a media capacity were not allowed in the locker room. I'd heard that maybe about a year ago. And I was like, that is crazy. And I'm like, they're not allowed today. And so the locker room was closed in 2020. And then it was also closed to media again in 2021.
Right.
So they finally allowed women who work for the team to be part of the open locker room sessions last season, 2022, which was the first year that locker room was back. So, they told me that they planned to change it in 2020, but then they couldn't. But it's still like, okay, in 2020, like you weren't allowing women who worked for your team in 2020 to go into the locker room. Like that's like 30 years late. Like That's crazy to me. And I don't know of any other team that had that policy in place. And that's just, you can't do your job if that's the case. Like you're at a disadvantage to your male colleagues who can go into the locker room and build relationships.
What about women in the office attempting to build relationships with their peers, potentially professional athletes, just common decency, being able to communicate with somebody, and then maybe like kind of an unwritten rule that everybody else has to kind of tell them, we're not in favor of you doing that. It's probably in your best interest not to do that. Like the Cardinals, in my opinion, like commenting on that, I think would be necessary. I think it's absolutely something that they've needed to address as it relates to all this stuff coming out, but just as it relates to, within their Tempe facility. And it sounds like potentially people are moving outside of the Tempe office. Some people have reported that. How did you come about that information with women potentially interacting and not being able to interact, I should say, with the professional athletes on the team?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to several women who have worked there, and they all kind of described the same thing of like, whether no matter what their job description was, it was sort of the same feeling of like, I felt like one of them said, we're walking on eggshells. Like I felt like I couldn't be in certain parts of the building. And if I was, I had to like get through real quick, get out of there. And, one woman told us that a player sat by her on a team flight and they had a nice conversation, and she'd seen him do that with her male colleagues and nobody thought anything of it. And then when it happened to her, when they had a conversation, she heard from a male colleague, it's not a good look for you to be doing that. So it felt like everything was kind of rooted in this like assumption that like the women who worked there were going to somehow be distractions to the players or the coaches or the football staff who were men. And that's just obviously a very sexist practice.
Right.
So yeah. And then my favorite personal anecdote in the story was that the frosted glass wall anecdote where, there was an area of the second floor where a department that was predominantly women were working, and coaches, it was a high traffic area of the office. So coaches, people would walk by, male football staffers would walk by, and they would stop and say hello and chat. And obviously that was the women understood that to be off limits to them, but the coaches didn't either they never heard the same rules or they didn't follow them. So the coaches were chatting. And then a few days later, the director of this department said to one of the women who worked there, hey, we're going to put up this wall. Like, a cubicle wall is pretty short, so you can see over it. So they added this like several foot extension to the top of a cubicle wall, basically to block the women from anyone walking by and to essentially cut off those conversations. And they never heard the woman who I spoke to who worked behind that wall. She did not hear from anyone directly that Michael Bidwill wanted that. It was just explained to her as, oh, we're going to cut down on hallway traffic here, some euphemism like that to kind of like couch it. So it wasn't ever directly explained. We're doing this because Michael doesn't like it when women talk to men. Like that was never explicitly said.
Right.
But that is the way that she interpreted it, and the way that others that I spoke to also interpreted it, because they saw the wall and they were like, oh, I know exactly why that was put up. Right. Like, so again, that's like an unwritten thing because nothing was set in stone that, we put up this wall because of this reason. Like they never said that to anyone directly, but the people who worked there felt that that was why it was put up. And, sure, maybe you're trying to get your workers to be more productive, but you're also like cutting down on camaraderie and like, the feeling of being a team and a family in the office. So that did not go over well with the employees who were in that area.
I'll get you out of here on this, Kalyn. Again, reader work, fantastic stuff at The Athletic. It's come out. The Cardinals are kind of making a big show of it. They're bringing a bunch of their team employees out to Los Angeles for the Rams game this weekend. They put it out there. We got 2 private jets for this weekend's game. Do you feel like a lot of this that's come after the fact of obviously you're reporting now and what's happened in the spring, the NFLPA grades, is this true change by the Cardinals or is this damage control, right? I mean, you finish next to last near the Washington Commanders owned by Dan Snyder in the NFLPA grades. And then subsequently now you're being sued. People are coming out to report on basically just a toxic work environment. Do you think that based on the people that if you've had contact with them now that still work there, this is true change or is this a Band-Aid?
The people who work there mainly felt it was kind of a Band-Aid. So when I asked the Cardinals, I got to talk to, obviously like Cardinals PR and some people in the organization just for context and all of these things. And I asked, did you have any of these things planned before Terry McDonough came out with his claims that this was a hostile workplace? Because it's very easy to think, oh, okay, all of these things were public after that happened. Like the listening sessions happened after Terry. They made all these changes this summer. They redid the bathrooms this summer. They had summer Fridays, shorter hours, food trucks on Fridays, little perks like that. You just mentioned the Rams game trip. They hired an independent consulting firm to do a review of the workplace as well. And all of that was announced after Terry's claims which were very public and very negative PR. So it's easy to think, well, obviously that was all a reaction to this. But they told me that no, in fact, they had already planned these things. Now, I don't have any documentation for that. I just have to take them at their word that they had planned the listening sessions. They planned to do a workplace review. And Sean Mayo, the director of HR right now, he did do listening sessions when he was first hired in July and August of 2021. So that may be true that this was his second round of listening sessions and he was always planning to do them, the timing, whatever. But I do think it's probably safe to say that like the negative PR of the survey of the NFLPA report cards of Terry, it may have just accelerated that timeline a little bit for them to actually put some of these things in motion now. So it is an interesting, the timing is very interesting. And yeah, one person I spoke to who works there was like, I like these, this is nice. Like all of these things are nice, but we're all kind of questioning like, why? Like, is this really being done in our best interest, or is it being done to kind of make us forget the things that are happening? Somebody said like, okay, great, we have all these things on Fridays, but like this is supposed to make us forget what's happening between Monday and Thursday.
Right.
So I think they're trying. I think they're making some of it is a good faith effort, like an independent review. That's great. Like that's somebody else who's assessing your workplace. And hopefully they'll take some of those, whatever they find, they'll take that into account and make some changes. And I also thought, the last thing I'll say is I really thought Michael Bidwill's statement to us was really interesting, because I'm going to pull it up and read it because I don't want to paraphrase it incorrectly.
Well, he admitted
needing
to make some changes. And I think that comes with knowing that you're under a microscope as a franchise.
Yeah. He said, I certainly have room to grow, and with the benefit of hindsight, would have done some things differently over the years. I also know that my direct approach doesn't always land well, and I'm working on that. So, and there's like 2 more sentences after that. That wasn't his full statement, but that was the part that really I was like, wow, okay. So like he, because you could go several ways with a statement like that. Like you could deny, or you could just focus on what you're doing that's new, and kind of ignore what people are alleging of you. But he actually was like, I've made mistakes, basically. So I thought that was actually a really interesting statement, and it wasn't what I expected.
Well, if anything, the good news of all of this coming out, if there is good news, is the people that work there, that continue to work there, are having their lives made better by reports like this. So thank you so much, Kalyn, for taking the time today. Again, check her out, senior NFL writer at The Athletic. Read the article. It is absolutely worth your read. One more time. It is called The Troubling Arizona Cardinal Workplace Culture That Has Some Employees Working in Fear. Thank you so much, Kalyn.
Thanks, Johnny.